Have you ever wondered what kind of punishments were inflicted on criminals a long time ago?
Press pictures in back issues of a French paper show French traitors in Nazi uniform. They paid the price of treachery before an FFI firing squad.
If you think you have what it takes to watch, join us as we look at some of history's most brutal execution methods. Ancient origins. Hanging was a type of lethal punishment introduced to Britain by the Germanic Anglo-Saxon tribes in the 5th century. The gallows were an important symbol in Germanic culture. The noble Hengist and Horsa, as well as their comrades, utilized a rather rough and out-of-hand style of hanging, which only resembled our clean and tidy modern method in one way. It worked quite effectively. William the Conqueror later ordered that it be replaced by castration and blindness for all crimes except hunting royal deer. But Henry I reinstated hanging as a method of execution for a variety of misdeeds. Although other techniques of death, including boiling, burning, and beheading, were widely utilized during the medieval period, hanging had become the primary punishment for capital crimes. If you've ever wondered how hanging kills, the position behind the ear has specific advantages and is best calculated to result in fast and painless death because it works in 3 separate ways to achieve the same goal. First and foremost, it will result in death by strangulation, which was the only cause of death in the old procedure prior to the lengthy drop. Second, it dislocates the vertebrate, which is now the underlying cause of mortality. Third, if a third element is required, it tends to internally tear the jugular vein, resulting in very immediate death. However, there is a simple truth to it all. Despite all the improvements we've seen, even the finest physician, biologist, or other scientist cannot pinpoint the precise time when a hanged person stops feeling pain. According to pro-hanging propaganda, death by hanging is almost instantaneous, but others claim it takes no more than 2 or 3 minutes, a quarter of an hour or much more, as in the case of Antonio Sprekage in Canada in 1919, which took 1 hour and 11 minutes to hang. The punishment to be hanged by the neck until dead addresses this issue through intelligent law. The operative words are, until dead. Methods of execution. Until the 1890s, hanging was the most common method of execution in the United States. When Delaware and Washington's courts overturned the death penalty, hanging remained legal. The final hanging occurred on January 25, 1996, in Delaware. If lethal injection is not possible, a firing squad is still used in 4 states for execution. The most recent execution using this approach was Ronnie Gardner. New York constructed the first electric chair in 1888 and executed William Kemmler in 1890. Other states quickly followed this execution approach. Today, electrocution is not utilized as the sole method of execution in any state, though some jurisdictions still use it if the inmate requests it or if lethal injection is not possible. Cyanide gas was first used in Nevada in 1924 as a more merciful method of execution. G. John was the first person executed with deadly gas. The authorities attempted to inject cyanide gas into John's cell while he slept. This proved impossible since gas spilled from his cell. Therefore, a gas chamber was built. The gas chamber was last used on March 3, 1999, when Walter Legrand, a German national, was killed in Arizona. Currently, 11 states allow fatal gas as a means of execution, although all use lethal injection as their principal method. Oklahoma became the first state to use lethal injection as a method of execution in 1977. But it would be another 5 years before Charles Brooks became the first person killed by lethal injection in Texas on December 7, 1982. Today, all states with the death penalty use this procedure. Gallows method of pole hanging. The gallows, which are used to execute the death sentence by hanging, are often made consisting of 2 upright posts and a crossbeam, although they can also be made up of a single upright with a beam extending from the top. The Roman gallows represented the crucifixion, and in previous Bible translations, the term gallows was used to denote the cross on which Jesus was executed. Another type of gallows from the Middle Ages was discovered at Montfaucon near Paris. This was a square building made up of masonry columns, joined in each tier by wooden crosspieces. Under the gallows were pits, into which the bodies fell after being disarticulated by exposure to the elements. In the classic gallows, the condemned stands on a platform or drop, the rope hangs from the crossbeam, and the noose at the end is wrapped around the neck. Hanging occurs when the person drops many feet, the knot in the rope being so tight that the fall breaks the spinal cord, resulting in instant death. Czechoslovakia pole hanging. The Czech Republic's Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms prohibits capital punishment, as do international legal duties stemming from the Czech Republic's membership in both the Council of Europe and the European Union. Historically, the death penalty was authorized and utilized in the Czech Republic when it was part of Czechoslovakia until it was abolished by the Federal Criminal Code in 1990. The final execution was carried out in 1989. Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk's presidency resulted in 16 executions. 4 of them were for military treason. Masaryk was a staunch opponent of capital punishment and repeatedly exercised his right to commute death sentences. Edvard Benes, his successor, sentenced 8 people to death, 3 of whom were charged with military treason. Following his retirement, 2 additional convicts were hanged prior to the country's conquest. Soon after the Communist Party fell from power in 1989, Václav Havel, the new president, fought for the repeal of the death penalty in parliament. In May 1990, a criminal law reform replaced the death penalty with life in prison. World War II execution. Karl Hermann Frank served as a Sudeten German Nazi official in the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia both before and during World War II. He rose to the rank of Obergruppenführer and oversaw the Protectorate's Nazi police apparatus, which included the Gestapo, South Dakota, and Kripo. After the war, he was prosecuted, convicted, and killed by hanging for arranging the atrocities in the Czech villages of Lidice and Lazaki. In our thumbnail, we can see what pole hanging looks like, as prisoners are prepped to be hanged. Both men and women were hanged, so hanging laws did not discriminate. Stoning execution. Stoning, also known as lapidation, is a form of lethal punishment in which a group of people throw stones at someone until they die from blunt trauma. It has been used as a method of punishment for serious offenses since ancient times. The Torah and Talmud both call for stoning as a penalty for several sins. Over the ages, Rabbinic Judaism imposed several procedural limits, rendering these commandments largely unenforceable. Although stoning is not stated in the Quran, classical Islamic jurisprudence used it as a had penalty for specific types of zina based on hadith. It also established several procedural constraints, making zina difficult to demonstrate. Stoning appears to have been the primary means of capital punishment in ancient Israel. Its use dates to the early Christian era, while Jewish courts later shunned stoning punishments. Only a few sporadic cases of legal stoning have been documented in Islamic pre-modern history. The criminal laws of most modern Muslim-majority countries are based on Western models. In recent decades, numerous states have incorporated stoning and other hudud punishments into their penal codes because of Islamist movements. These rules are especially important to religious conservatives because of their scriptural origins, however. In reality, they have played a mostly symbolic role and have fallen out of favor. In recent years, stoning has been a legal or customary punishment in Iran, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Mauritania, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Yemen, northern Nigeria, Afghanistan, Brunei, and tribal areas of Pakistan, including the northwest Karam Valley and the northwest Kwezai-Baizai region, though it is rarely used. In some of these countries, like Afghanistan, insurgents, tribal leaders, and others have committed extrajudicial killings. Although stoning is a legal form of punishment in certain other nations, such as Nigeria and Pakistan, it has never been used in practice. Human rights organizations denounce stoning. Immurement execution. Immurement, also known as immuration or live entombment, is a type of imprisonment, generally until death, in which a person is placed in an enclosed chamber with no exits. This includes cases where humans have been confined in exceedingly tight spaces, such as a coffin. When employed as a form of execution, the prisoner is simply left to die of malnutrition or dehydration. This method of execution differs from being buried alive, in which the victim usually dies of asphyxiation. Immurement, on the other hand, has been utilized as an early form of life imprisonment in some circumstances, with victims being fed and watered on a regular basis. In a few cases, humans have survived for months or years after being walled up, and some people, such as anchorites, have opted to be immured. Crushed by elephant. Historically, several emperors in South and Southeast Asia used elephants to execute people. This was frequent for almost 4,000 years. The Romans and Carthaginians were also known to do this. The elephant would step on the condemned person's head, the one who was sentenced to death. Usually, handlers trained the elephant to gently place its huge foot on the person's head. At this point, witnesses checked under the elephant's foot to ensure that the prisoner had committed the crime. Frequently, the condemned would scream and beg the witnesses to deny it was him. If a witness testified that this was not the culprit, they would most likely commit perjury. Perjury may be punished with death back then. Few witnesses denied that the condemned was the offender, for fear of being crushed by an elephant. Then the mahu, or elephant driver, issued the order, and the elephant pushed down with its weight. The skull fractured, and the foot smashed the head flat. Occasionally, the elephant would drag the condemned through the streets before crushing. Some elephants crushed their limbs and legs first, intensifying the suffering. Mazzatello. The mazzatello, or mazzilatura, was a form of lethal punishment used by the Papal States for the most heinous crimes that involved the inflicting of brain damage. The method was named after the tool used for execution, a huge, long-handled mallet, or poleaxe. The last known usage of this method of punishment was in September 1806. The Papal States' most usual capital punishments were hanging or beheading. The mazzatello was one of the most brutal methods of execution ever devised, requiring minimal skill on the part of the executioner and superhuman acquiescence by the victim. The convicted would be carried to a scaffold in a public square in Rome, followed by a priest. The platform also housed a coffin and a masked executioner clothed in black. First, a prayer would be offered for the prisoner's soul. The mallet would then be elevated and swung through the air to create velocity before being brought down on the prisoner's head, like how animals are slaughtered in stockyards today. The condemned was frequently knocked unconscious rather than executed instantaneously, and the prisoner's throat was slit with a knife. Mazzatello, like drawing and quartering, was reserved for especially loathsome offenses. Dismemberment execution. Dismemberment is the act of totally detaching or removing limbs from a living or deceased person. It has been used as a type of capital punishment on humans, particularly in the context of regicide. In contrast to medical amputation of limbs, dismemberment is frequently lethal. In criminology, there is a distinction between offensive dismemberment, which is the primary goal of the dismemberer, and defensive dismemberment, which is motivated by a desire to remove evidence. In 2019, American psychiatrists and medical professionals Michael H. Stone, Gary Brucato, and Ann Burgess presented rigorous criteria for distinguishing dismemberment from the act of mutilation, as both terms are often used interchangeably. They proposed that dismemberment entails the complete removal by any means of a large section of the body of a living or deceased person, specifically the head, arms, hands, torso, pelvic area, legs, or feet. Mutilation, on the other hand, is defined as the removal or irreparable disfigurement by any means of a smaller portion of one of those larger sections of a living or deceased person. The last would entail castration, disembowelment, and flaying. According to these parameters, removing a whole hand is dismemberment, while removing or damaging a finger is mutilation. Decapitating a whole head is dismemberment, while removing or damaging a part of the face is mutilation. And removing a whole torso is dismemberment, while removing or damaging a breast or the organs contained within the torso is mutilation. Upright jerker. The upright jerker was an execution method used during the 19th and early 20th century. It was designed to replace hangings but did not gain popularity and was discontinued by the 1930s. As in a hanging, a cord would be looped around the prisoner's neck. Rather than sliding down through a trapdoor, the condemned would be brutally dragged into the air using a system of weights and pulleys. The goal of this execution procedure was to ensure a quick death by breaking the prisoner's neck. Executions of this nature occurred in various U.S. states, most notably Connecticut, where murderer and gang member Gerald Chapman was executed using this method. The upright jerker was never particularly effective at breaking the prisoner's neck. Instead, the condemned were often strangled. In one such case, a man named James Stevens was left contorting and gurgling until he died from asphyxiation. Blood eagle execution. A brutal, ritualized method of torture and execution practiced by Nordic people during the Viking Age was so gruesome that some scholars questioned whether it could even be performed on a human body. However, researchers recently discovered that blorn, or blood eagle, was anatomically possible and could have been performed using known Viking weapons. Victims were typically captured in battle, according to descriptions of the blood eagle in poems and prose dating from the 11th to the 13th centuries. Captors would cut and open large flaps of skin and muscle from the backs of their living victims, then sever the ribs from the spine, opening the ribs out to the sides to form wings. The torturer would then finish the ritual by removing the victim's intact lungs and laying them over the extended ribs. According to scientists, carrying out such a heinous act would have been anatomically challenging for the torturer, but it would not have been impossible. Immolation execution. Death by burning, often known as immolation, is an execution method that involves combustion or exposure to high temperatures. It has a lengthy history as a method of capital punishment. Many societies have used it to punish crimes like treason, heresy, and witchcraft. The best-known execution of this sort is burning at the stake, in which the condemned is tied to a large wooden stake and a fire is lit beneath them. Scalping torture. Scalping is the act of cutting or tearing a part of the human scalp with hair attached from the head, which is usually done in combat with the scalp as a trophy. Scalp taking is considered part of a larger cultural practice of removing and displaying human body parts as trophies, and it may have evolved as an alternative to taking human heads, as scalps were easier to grab, transport, and preserve for later exhibition. Scalping evolved separately in a variety of cultures in the Old and New World. Falling. Since antiquity, people have been executed by throwing or dropping them from tremendous heights. People executed in this manner die because of injuries sustained by a high-speed impact with the ground. In ancient Delphi, the sacrilegious were thrown from the top of the Hyampeia, the high cliff of the Phaedriades, to the east of the Castalian Spring. During Argentina's dirty war in the late 1970s, people who were surreptitiously kidnapped were frequently thrown from aircraft in what became known as death flights. Iran may have utilized this method of execution for the crime of sodomy. In 2015, members of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant pushed men accused of being gay off towers. Bamboo torture. Bamboo torture is a method of torture and execution in which a bamboo shoot grows through the victim's body. It was supposedly utilized in East and South Asian countries such as China, India, and most notably Japan, although there is insufficient evidence to back up these assertions. Quartering by horses execution. Quartering was occasionally conducted by attaching the body's limbs to 4 horses and spurring them in various directions. To prevent potential traitors, the resulting body parts were usually gibbeted or displayed in public places around the city, town, or country. Lingqi. Lingqi, which translates as slow slicing or death by 1,000 cuts, was a type of torture and execution utilized in China from the 10th century to the early 20th century. It was also deployed in Vietnam and Korea. In this technique of execution, a knife was used to gradually remove sections of the body over time, eventually culminating in death. Lingqi was reserved for offenses considered particularly severe, such as treason. Even after the practice was abolished, the concept persisted in many forms of media. Damnatio ad bestias. Damnatio ad bestias was a type of Roman capital punishment in which the condemned individual was murdered by wild animals, typically lions or other large cats. This form of execution, which first arose in the Roman Republic during the 2nd century BC, was part of a larger category of blood games known as bestiarii. Damnatio ad bestias was a popular form of entertainment among Rome's lower-class people. The killing of wild creatures, such as Barbary lions, was part of the Flavian amphitheater's first games in AD 80. Between the 1st and 3rd centuries AD, this penalty was also imposed on the worst criminals, runaway slaves, and Christians. Hemlock poisoning. Hemlock poisoning can occur if you mistakenly consume poison hemlock. Symptoms can include vomiting, convulsions, and respiratory failure. There is no remedy for hemlock poisoning. Your doctor will treat your symptoms, but the illness may be fatal. You can avoid hemlock poisoning by eliminating any hemlock plants in your yard. People used hemlock poisoning on others, and one famous man who was poisoned this way was the great Greek philosopher, Socrates. Lethal injection execution. Lethal injection is the practice of injecting one or more medicines into a person with the intention of causing fast death. The primary use of this process is capital punishment, although the term can also refer to euthanasia and other forms of suicide. The medications cause the victim to go unconscious, halt their breathing, and induce a heart arrhythmia in that order. It was first developed in the United States and is now a legal means of execution in mainland China, Thailand, Guatemala, Taiwan, the Maldives, Nigeria, and Vietnam, though Guatemala abolished the death penalty in civil cases in 2017 and has not carried out an execution since 2000. And the Maldives has never carried out an execution since independence. Although Taiwan allows lethal injection as an execution method, no executions have occurred in this manner. The same is true in Nigeria. The Philippines likewise utilized lethal injection until the death sentence was repealed in 2006. Although initially adopted as a more humane mode of execution, lethal injection has been criticized, with some calling it cruel and unusual. Opponents criticize the use of lethal injections by unskilled prison staff and the lack of certainty that the victim will be unconscious in every case. There have been reports of sentenced people being injected with paralytics and subsequently a cardiac arrest-inducing substance while still aware. This has been likened to torture. Blowing from a gun execution. Following the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the British utilized blowing from a gun to execute rebels and Indian sepoys who had been found guilty of desertion. In the latter half of the 18th century, the British began implementing blowing from guns, following the methods previously used by the Mughals. Peine forte et dure. Peine forte et dure, which means hard and forceful punishment in French, was a method of torture used in the common legal system in which a defendant who refused to plead was subjected to having heavier and heavier stones placed on their chest until a plea was entered or death occurred. Many defendants charged with capital offenses would refuse to plead to prevent confiscation of assets. If the offender pleaded guilty or not guilty and was executed, their heirs would inherit nothing, with their property passing to the state. If they refused to plead, their heirs would get their fortune, regardless of whether they died in the process. Coffin torture. Coffin torture was used in medieval times. This method involved stripping a victim naked and locking them into a cage roughly the same size as their body. The cage was then hung somewhere noticeable, such as the city walls, and the victim was allowed to die of hunger, thirst, or exposure to the elements, with their body picked apart by birds and insects. It's incredible to think that human beings came up with these barbaric forms of execution. It baffles me, to say the least. Which one was your favorite? Why don't you tell us which one it is? Well, that's it for now. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please give us a like and let us know in the comments what you think. Check out our other videos and subscribe to be part of the fun. Click on the notification icon so you can see our new videos as soon as they're uploaded. Thank you for watching and see you next time.